What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name's Phillip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And today we have another great interview for you today. We talked to Allegra Hyde, who is a fiction writer of a new novel called Eleutheria, which is like this climate fiction novel that's centered around a protagonist named Willa Marks, who embarks on a journey to join a group of climate activists on an island called Eleutheria in the Bahamas. And they're hell-bent on averting the world from a climate disaster by any means necessary. So we talked a lot about that book, but she's also written a short story collection called Of This New World. And this conversation was really fun, I think, especially for Ben and I to just pick Allegra's brain about like fiction writing and especially novel writing.
We're back talking to climate writers. This is Lydia Millett 2.0. And I actually, if I remember correctly, Phil, you actually picked this out. You were the one that was like, why do we talk to another climate writer?
Yeah.
So this is not me. I did not put my thumb on the scales for this one.
Yeah, Ben isn't the only one ringing the bell for climate change and climate activism. And for some reason, I feel like I was looking back at some of our older episodes too, and like there's just so many. I'd say like at least 50% of the episodes have some relation to either climate change or like apocalyptic events, or it's in that wheelhouse. So this is just another one to add to the bucket.
We're just it's on our brains. It feels like a lot. I feel like one of the things that Allegra does really, really well is kind of tease out this space between like activism and how activism can be, I guess, like subverted, and that the purity of activism doesn't always feel like it comes through, and it's so easy to kind of co-opt movements and use them, especially with kind of charismatic leaders. There's gently a cult situation going on in Eleutheria, and so I think she's really interested in kind of pulling apart what happens with movements and how they work, and how even kind of the best of intentions or best laid plans can be kind of polluted.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked a lot about that and just like her own relationship to activism and activist groups, having like lived all over the world and kind of interacted with these different types of activist groups or like communes, things within that wheelhouse. I think that she has a lot of background and experience in, and like one of the things that I think is interesting about this novel, and she's talked about it in a number of interviews, is the value of utopian thinking, or like the value of hopeful thinking, and how regardless of whether different movements become compromised or the messaging becomes co-opted, that doesn't take away from the fact of like the possibilities or the value of like thinking about an otherwise, thinking about a different way that things could be, and working towards that, even if you will inevitably fail at different points along the way.
Yeah, and I feel like it was a really good conversation, at the very least, because I'm, as Phil knows, like gently black-pilled. Like I think I'm full doomer on a lot of things, and my belief is that our systems have failed us and will continue to fail us, that there's no kind of help coming on the way. And so I think I come from a position of always feeling distrustful when I see hope kind of laundered, particularly in the climate space. The language of it's going to be okay. The tech companies have a solution. It's just around the corner. I think I just always have this chip on my shoulder when I see that kind of the language of hopefulness deployed, because I feel like often it can be deployed in very insidious ways, where it's like, hey, this corporation wants you to do nothing, and they want to kind of offer you the hope of some future, some mysterious future action as a reason not to demand, become desperate, to feel like you need to kind of break things down right in the here and now. And so I feel like came to the conversation like that, ready for the guns to be blazing, And honestly, it was a good conversation, and I think Allegra does a good job of, again, I think as Phil was talking about, navigating. Well, what does it mean to imagine a better world? What does it mean to, I hope in a much more person to person, not as it's, necessarily it's not about plugging hope into those institutions necessarily, but I think about hope being about we can find better alternatives and think about better ways of living. And again, not being naive about that, understanding that there can also be ways that the utopian ideal becomes polluted, or the utopian ideal can be leveraged against people. But that does not discount the importance or the role of hope and hopefulness. So this was a conversation with someone who, I feel like I don't necessarily see eye to eye with, but I just really appreciated her perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like this, without getting into spoilers about not only the novel, but some of the things we talk about, like I think that Allegra does a really good job of also exploring like the ways in which the theoretical, like the theory behind some of the praxis of like these different activist groups, like how that can be compromised or how that can be swayed by different organizations. And like that's definitely like a big part of the novel in some ways, without getting too into it. So yeah, I mean, I think this was a really fun conversation. We hope that you all enjoy it, and how about we just jump right in there?
Let's go.
Allegra Hyde is the author of the new novel Eleutheria, as well as the short story collection Of This New World, which won the John Simmons Short Fiction Award through the Iowa Short Fiction Award Series. She is a recipient of 3 Pushcart Prizes, and her writing has also been anthologized in Best American Travel Writing, Best Women's Travel Writing, Best of the Net, and Best Small Fiction, as well as many other venues. Currently, she's teaching writing at Oberlin College. Allegra, thanks so much for coming on to talk with us.
Oh, thank you for that intro. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. I think we always like to start the conversations these days just asking, how people are doing. How's it feeling? Your new novel just came out. What's the vibe?
The vibe is it's weird. It's so strange to have had this story and this project just live inside my mind for 5 years more plus, and now for it to be out in the world, accessible to anyone. But I'm also just super grateful that it's been able to be out there, and it's been really fun doing some events and hearing some feedback. So I would say it's been weird in a good way.
I feel that. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the creators we've been talking to recently have had that exact response of like, things are weird, it's cool, but also like I don't know what to make of it yet. I'm curious, like, before we started recording, you were saying you are going to AWP tomorrow. I think one thing we're really interested in, especially after the last year, is just like for creators who are releasing projects in, this ongoing pandemic, like what has that experience been like for you? And I don't know if your short story collection also came out during the pandemic, but like, in general, kind of what has the experience been like kind of launching the novel?
Yeah, I think the story collection came out in 2016.
Okay.
So it was pre-pandemic, but it came out in October, and then November hit and we entered the Trump era. So it kind of came out in another sort of disaster. But I guess putting a book out in 2022, in a way, we're amidst many disasters, but I think it was in some ways easier than if the book had come out right when the pandemic started, and folks didn't know how to use Zoom yet to set up events. So I think the machinery is sort of in place for authors to be able to reach readers. We've all kind of figured out how to do our best within these new parameters. So, I do really love in-person events. I love getting to just feel the energy of a room, to be able to look potential readers or readers in the eye. I can't do that on Zoom, but it's better than nothing. So I'm glad that it's there at all. And of course it creates some accessibility for people who might not have been able to go to in-person events anyways.
Do you think that this kind of has had any impact on your writing, or maybe your relationship to writing?
Yeah, I live alone, so the pandemic was a real solo journey for me. I do have a cat, so it wasn't totally solo, but I think that during the pandemic, I just realized that in order to make sure that I was still connected with my literary community, I had to just take the extra step to reach out to people and have just long distance writing relationships where we're exchanging work, we're talking on Zoom, and that way I think I kind of was able to build some stronger writing partnerships because it pushed me to take that extra step. And during the pandemic, I actually wrote a lot, and I wrapped up the edits on the novel and completed a second story collection manuscript called The Last Catastrophe. So it probably did absorb some some vibes from what was going on, but I tried to just use that time as best I could. Would I do it again that way? No, but that's what happened.
I'm wondering, in setting up, kind of talking about the book, I mean, it feels like it's really interested in this question of movements and what makes for effective movements and what makes for effective social change. And I'm wondering if you can maybe just talk about like what drove you to this question. And I'm also, I guess, interested in how much of this is also about you yourself kind of unpacking these questions around what makes for effective change, especially around something like a climate movement.
Yeah, on a personal level, I, of course, ask myself every day, am I living the right life given the climate emergency that we're in? And should I be, blowing up pipelines or something? Am I really kind of taking an easy out by teaching creative writing and writing my novels? I hope that by writing novels about climate change and by trying to participate in the conversation and just contribute to the cultural consciousness in some sense, that is a contribution, but it never feels like enough, and honestly, it probably is not. But I think the book is also a product of my own reckoning with how to live an ethical life in our current moment. And I think I also wanted, when it came to the book itself, which explores social movements, which asks, like, what would it take to actually catalyze a mass mobilization that truly moved towards a sustainable future? I wanted to use fiction as a space to play out that question and play out scenarios and see where a story could take us, and that felt useful to me as a human person and interesting to me as a writer. And I have more to say about that, but I will pause there.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading is that it is a novel that feels like it's very interested in kind of the logistics of these movements. You are really kind of mapping out, maybe just to walk listeners through it. We've got a charismatic leader who's gently culty, but we also have, this climate scientist on this, island. You also have kind of these influencer kids who are kind of hopefully there to draw some national attention, international attention, to help kind of spur this movement. And so I'm wondering how much time was spent on your end thinking about, I guess, the logistics side of things, because it feels like this novel is really interested in all right, what does it really take? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was really interested in logistics. I've never thought of it in that way. I think this goes back to maybe an initial goal for the book, which was to write quote unquote climate fiction that wasn't just showing a doomsday scenario and kind of just trying to show surviving in a apocalyptic landscape. I wanted to show people wrestling with solutions or possible solutions, and maybe those solutions turn out to not be perhaps the way we would want to go, but it seemed useful to again use fiction as a space of testing, of kind of playing out a thought experiment and showing how things could happen. And it did take a lot of research. I read just a ton of books that were about like climate projections, that were about social movements, that were about environmental psychology. And I think the thing that fiction can do is synthesize a lot of different fields and bring them together and put them in conversation, hopefully in an engaging way. So I tried to just bring together all those ideas in the book.
Yeah, I think maybe a good place for us to go from there is just kind of drilling down a bit into the protagonist, or the main character, maybe is a better term for the novel, with Willa Marks. And I'm curious, I think there's some more specific questions I want to get into with her later on, but like in general, maybe how would you describe Willa as a character and kind of the journey she's going on in this book?
Well, Willa is a young woman, and she's someone who grew up with doomsday prepping parents and kind of lived a very isolated childhood out in New Hampshire. And her journey in the book is one of trying to make her way in the world and trying to find a way to live that pushes back against her parents' way of seeing the world. So if our parents were people who had kind of given up on the possibility of the world getting better, Willa reverses that by approaching reality with a kind of relentless optimism, I would say, and a kind of extreme hopefulness. And that brings her into contact with a lot of different types of people, from a Harvard professor to Freegans to ultimately the group at Camp Hope on the island of Eleutheria. And so she's someone who's kind of taking optimism to an extreme. She's an idealist. I would say she's a seeker, and those things can serve her sometimes, and sometimes they can cause a lot of trouble for her and for other people. So I hope at the end of the day, she's a complex, complicated, flawed human like all of us.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touch on one of the things I was really interested in is that in my eyes, one of the key aspects of the novel and Willa's character specifically is kind of this hopeful thinking that she has in the wake of crises, whether it's climate change or, personal relationships that she has with people like her love interest, Sylvia Gill, who's the Harvard professor. In some ways, it's almost like that optimism or that hopefulness is a form of activism in and of itself. It's a radical choice for her when she's juxtaposed against some of the other characters in the novel. I'm curious, how you came to that, or maybe why that showing that kind of mindset was important for you in making this book.
Yeah, I think when I observe how people are reacting to climate change generally, there seem to be kind of two dominant modes of thinking. One is just an approach to climate change that ignores it or assumes that if it's there, it's like hundreds of years down the line. We don't have to really worry about it. Business as usual. We're just going to keep going. And then there's another kind of dominant mindset of despair, basically, which means you've read the statistics, you've looked at what's coming, and it feels overwhelming, and the reaction is a kind of a nihilistic stance ultimately. And both of those approaches won't fix the problem. And so I'm interested in putting hope and possibility into the conversation more, but with the caveat that it's hope and possibility that also brings a reckoning and an understanding of the past that got us into this crisis in the first place. I think hope and possibility that doesn't also kind of carry with it just a recognition of the colonial, white supremacist, extractivist kind of mindsets that have kind of undergird the crisis is a hope that will ultimately turn back in on itself and just perpetuate those forces.
Yeah, I think there's one of the through lines that I really loved is this. I think you keep coming back to this motif of kind of history and memory. There's these vignettes between some of the chapters where you're talking about the history of the island, which is located somewhere, I think, in the Bahamas. And so you're basically kind of bringing up the history and talking about the history because, here we have Camp Hope, this activist, largely white movement that is located on these islands that is ignoring some of the history of colonization that has happened there. And I think in some ways I see implied is maybe doomed to fail in some ways because of its ignorance of history. And so maybe you can talk about the importance of kind of, or the value of history and memory in the context of a working activist movement.
Sure. I think in some ways you said it yourself quite well there. So, but I guess to reiterate, I think that a movement that isn't prioritizing the voices of marginalized groups, the leadership of marginalized groups, is a movement that is both ethically wrong and also, I think, just structurally doomed to fail as well. So by having that thread of history run through the novel, I wanted to have that as a touchstone as we see Camp Hope kind of go through its own process and kind of play out what would happen in this fictional scenario, and hopefully leave readers with a sense of just what a movement for moving forward would actually require. Hopefully, I hope that readers leave the book ultimately with a sense of possibility, alongside, as I've said, that awareness.
Yeah, I think there's a way of thinking about, because I also see, I think, as Phil is kind of saying, this hopefulness in the protagonist, and I will say I think sometimes I feel frustrated by by kind of hopefulness that I see in the climate movement, because I think sometimes it can be hope without action, or hope without a kind of reality or a reality check of like just how dire sometimes the reality is. But I also see, I think, when that memory and that history is kind of undergirding it, that there is that sense of we need to have an understanding of reality that we can inject our hopefulness into. I mean, can you maybe talk about those things? They felt like they were at times in conflict, that there's a tension between them here when we're thinking about like a realistic reckoning, but also trying to find in some ways the silver lining. I mean, can you talk about how you grappled with that?
Well, I think the grappling with that was part of writing the book over and over and over again through the revision process, and trying to find a way to put those two things in conversation, also tell an engaging story. And through revision, I did my best to kind of show how moving forward necessitates a a kind of a paradigm shift that holds those two things at once, which isn't easy, but I think is ultimately the only way to do it.
Yeah. You know, I mean, this is maybe shifting gears a bit, but something that I also really loved in the novel is there, maybe emphasis isn't the right word, but there's a lot of kind of characters who are interacting with social media or are influencers or kind of using kind of modern social technology in ways that I find really interesting. I loved how Willa kind of sees these selfies and pictures taken of her as these terrariums. They're kind of like these time capsules where she's able to, you know, see herself in ways that she maybe can't in her day-to-day life. I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about how we engage with, you know, social media photography today. And I think that kind of motif around terrariums is kind of like a key tension throughout the whole novel. There's like Camp Hope in some ways is this terrarium within the island. It's like you kind of enter it and you're in this vacuum. And then whenever Willa leaves, it kind of feels like catastrophe happens because she's having to actually interact with the world versus, you know, like she lives with some twin cousins in Boston for a while. And there's a tension between like these twins who kind of, for all intents and purposes, kind of are out in the world a lot, kind of trying to be influencers and trying to kind of be noticed, versus Willa, who's kind of grew up kind of isolated and alienated. I'm kind of meandering here a bit, but I think there's an interesting tension there of like the twins, for instance, who never really feel like they kind of are at home in the society that they're living in, versus Willa, who ultimately finds a place for herself by putting herself into these uncomfortable situations. I'm wondering if maybe you could just talk a little bit maybe about the twins and Willa's relationship as a way to get into that.
Yeah, I love how you put that. And I think the cousins who take these photos of themselves that are staged and artificial in many ways, and they put them on the internet and in a way live kind of vicariously through this idealized version of themselves. And Willa, for a while, does that too. That photo, or those photos, as this idealized enclosed space, as you said, are kind of equivalent to Camp Hope as this closed, idealized environmental compound. And they both can only be perfect in a kind of if they're outside of reality in a way. And I think that relates to the book and my interest in utopian imagination and the sort of tension of pursuing or seeking perfection and the inability for perfection to be truly found, truly inhabited. So I think kind of in terms of Willa's journey through the book, she encounters different ways of basically coping with reality. And so the cousins' relationship to the photos, that's how they were coping with crisis, essentially. And the Freegans who she meets, they cope another way by trying to find a way to live ethically. Professor Sylvia Gill, again, has her kind of institutional castle around her, and then Camp Hope is yet another way. So by going through these different modes of coping, we are hopefully kind of get a sense of the different ways that people in our real world are currently dealing. But I think everything in the novel is a little bit exaggerated and distorted in this kind of slightly surrealist way. Yeah. It's
interesting. I was wondering as I was reading, like as you kind of just articulated, there's kind of, there's Willa, the cousins, the professor, Camp Hope. I'll kind of say those are like almost four factions, or like four kind of different sections that are kind of in conversation throughout the novel. I'm curious maybe like where the genesis of the project came from. Was Camp Hope the kind of the gateway into exploring all of this? And the reason I ask is because we were just talking to another author last week, and one section in their book that we found to be like so paramount to the whole thing, and it ended up being that they basically had wrote that like right before turning it in on like final edits or something like that. So I guess I'm just curious of like what it was like kind of conceptualizing the book.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to answer this question because on one hand, I could say I started working on it, I don't know, 5 years ago at the end of graduate school. But I think a more honest answer is that I first wrote a short story called Shark Fishing that was actually in my first collection. And even though it was the longest story in the collection, I just felt like I wasn't saying everything I wanted to say, or I hadn't quite said it right. And Camp Hope is in that story. So doing the novel was a way to go deeper in that story and to go deeper into Camp Hope. But at the end of the day, I think it was about going deeper into Willa, because I think so much of the book is really a project of unpacking her motivation for taking this really extreme action. And so a lot of the novel writing process was trying to understand her as a character. There are so many times while I was writing that I would almost get mad at her because I'd be like, why are you doing this on the page? Even though I, as an author, am making her do these things. I think the thing about maybe first person specifically is that it can almost feel like you're, at least for me, like you're transcribing a voice in your head, basically. And that voice can seem like it's coming from somewhere else. At least for me. So maybe that's why in some ways Willa would tell me things or tell me she had done things in a sense, and then I would try to understand why. So that was a big part of the book. But if we take this question back even further, before writing that short story, I just spent a lot of time in the Bahamas, doing environmental work there. I spent time in New Zealand as well on a lot of utopian, we could say utopian communities or aspiring utopian communities, hippie compounds, and I think it just my interest in groups of people who are trying to figure out different ways to live has been just a long-term, lifelong fascination for me. And so the novel kind of draws on a lot of just experiences I've had out in the world, interacting with groups that are trying to live differently, usually failing, but going for it anyways.
So I was reading up on your short story collection, which, as I understand it, is also kind of interested in this question of utopia. What do you think it is about, I guess, utopia as an idea that you feel drawn to?
Well, I think on one hand, I really admire people who have just the gumption to step away from mainstream society and try something different. And I just admire that kind of radical mentality. One of the first utopian communities I learned about was this place called Fruitlands, which was founded by Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's dad. And it was a kind of proto-vegan compound. And they had some really wild ideas about what would be a sort of ethical agricultural existence, which came up against some hard truths because they're in Massachusetts and it gets really cold there. And farming without animal labor can be pretty tough. So I was just interested in kind of the radical mentality, and I was also interested in the sort of comedic aspects of these enterprises because they do fail so spectacularly so often. And so I think the tension between idealism and practicality has just always fascinated me, and I love to just really get into these tensions between like an individual and a community, or other kind of possible points of conflict, I guess, within those sorts of spaces.
That's interesting. I think I really appreciated that tension, especially in the academic settings. Like, I did an MFA at University of Washington and a master's at Ohio University. And, I was teaching during those 4.5 years. And I think, once you're kind of like working within that system, at least for me, I kind of felt like that's where I was seeing so much of the compromise and that kind of idealized perspective that I had of like what academia was, or what, being a professor was. And I really did feel that like Sylvia Gill as a character does a really good job of personifying a lot of the struggles that I imagine, many people like myself who worked in academia for any amount of time feel, in terms of navigating, your own personal ideologies while also trying to like live a life, and live. So, not really a question there, but I thought like Sylvia Gill is a really good, personification of that.
And maybe, I guess the question for me would be like, it feels like the tension is there between that kind of the cynicism of academia, the sometimes cynicism of academia, and the hopefulness of activism. And I'm wondering, how that came about for you, whether that was a feeling of kind of moving through both academic and activist spaces, that you've kind of felt that to be true.
Yeah, I think in one sense it is a product of just having experienced academia myself, and also having dumpster dived with Freegans. But I think the decision to include Harvard specifically was kind of rooted in the larger architecture of the story that I wanted to tell, and that goes back to the history of the island. And one of the first things I learned about the island of the real island of Eleutheria was that when Puritan colonists showed up there with the intention of founding a ideal society, they renamed the island Eleutheria. Eventually that I would get dropped. And they just, everything, it was a disaster, and basically Puritans in Boston sent them some supplies as assistance. And to say thank you, those Puritans in the Bahamas sent back a ship full of Brasiletto wood. And that wood would be sold and would ultimately endow Harvard University. And I was just really interested in that relationship between these two places, this like extremely powerful institution that has produced all these world leaders, etc., and a country that has to bear the brunt of a colonial legacy and climate change, and just and I was just really interested in that relationship across time and place. And in the novel, I wanted to be able to depict a story that thought on kind of a larger scale and put all these places and people in conversation. Because when we make decisions about climate change in our kind of present moment, as I've been saying, I think we have to have that memory, that awareness of the past, and recognize how, a storm in one place that causes a bunch of damage isn't just the responsibility of that one city or that one town. It's like we all are connected to it, and we all are responsible, and we're all in this together in the end. And that's the kind of I guess just understanding that I hoped would come through.
One thing I've been asking a lot of writers recently, very selfishly, is that Ben and I are both working on what I'm saying longer works, novels, and I'm curious, especially you have this one short story collection that's already out. You have The Last Catastrophe, which is coming out. Eleutheria started from a short story. I'm curious, what's your relationship to the novel and novel writing? Is it something that's comfortable, or was that kind of like a pretty eye-opening experience, making this kind of book?
I found it so hard, so grueling. I think I have always felt so much more comfortable with short stories, in part because I could just sit down at my desk and write out the whole of a story, and maybe it has some holes in it. Maybe it will need to get edited 100 times, but I could see the whole arc and I could kind of understand it, hold it in my mind. But you can't do that with a novel, or else I just didn't have the right drugs to do it or something. But I couldn't sit, straight through for a week and write it out. And so having to sort of figure out how to hold this larger thing in my mind, how to maintain narrative momentum, just required a lot of back to the book study. I think I read about a lot about screenplays, for instance, so that I could just better understand plot mechanics. I read a ton of novels just written in the first person so that I could figure out how to just deal with having the same person talking for 300 pages, which is a lot. And so it was really, really hard. And yet I also feel compelled to do it again. I haven't started yet, but what sort of things are you both kind of coming up against right now in your work? In your longer projects.
And the longer work, yeah. Ben, are you?
I think I was going to say, I think for me, I think short fiction, short nonfiction, and short stories, I'm realizing how many of my habits are about getting me out, getting in and getting out as quickly as possible. And yeah, I guess how do you engage with, I just, there's something about my brain that is wired to be you can't if you take up too much time, a reader's just going to jump ship. And I feel like in some ways, and I don't know if this is true, but you can tell me if it is, I just have to get over that. And I'm wondering what are the tricks for kind of telling yourself, okay, yes, we can spend some time, we can build this moment or this scene out a little more, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to speak from any place of expertise. I feel like if I
you got a book.
I mean, I have this one book, but maybe after I've written 7 novels, I'd be maybe I can answer it. I don't know. I think the thing I tried to tell myself with writing the novel was that I could just write a lot and then cut it back, because I also have that just instinct towards concision that I think you pick up when you're writing in a short form. But with a novel, you do just have more space, and that more space and that extra space for me meant oftentimes going deeper into character motivations, and that's also what my editor was often pushing me to do, really getting into what is your protagonist thinking and feeling, so we can really be with her as a reader and then feel it too. And maybe that's why I don't know, many people can connect with characters in novels in a deeper way as readers, because you just get to know that person so much more, and you get to just really experience their experiences with them in a way that feels more like getting to know a person in real life. And yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you were like, oh, I'm now having conversations with Willa. Sometimes I'm frustrated with the things that she wants. I think maybe two parts. Like, when did that start happening? At what point where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to Willa? And then what were the conversations where you're like, I am most frustrated with the decision that you are making, and that I'm now going to write and kind of try to engage with?
I mean, I think it was happening throughout the process, just in different ways. And I mean, she was more of a stranger to me at the beginning. And then through the middle, I probably was getting most frustrated with her. And then towards the end, especially as I kind of did those final edits on the book, I felt a lot of tenderness towards her. And I think when I first started hearing from really early readers like blurbers, hear them mention Willa, something about her, it almost was like, oh, you know her too? Like we had this mutual friend or something. And that was that was part of the weirdness that has encompassed the publication of the book.
I love that. You know, it's funny. Like my background is mainly in creative nonfiction and writing essays and short stories. And I think for me, one of the things I'm struggling with is kind of what you're getting at of like, I'm writing a first person novel, and Ben and I are always talking about like, Ben, maybe I won't put words in your mouth, but you tend to not like first person, or at least writing in first person.
I think it's hard. It's harder to pull off.
Yeah, and it's I find that lately I've just been like reading. It was great reading your book, because it's like, oh, how do I even get this person to the next moment? Like, I feel like almost like they're speaking to me in another language, and right now I'm kind of deciphering what they're saying. And yeah, I think in general, just novel writing compared to some of the shorter work I've done really has elucidated some of my tendencies or blind spots that maybe I don't necessarily realize in a shorter space. So yeah, I don't know. In general, I think it's just been an interesting experience, probably because it's such a long project, right? Like, you kind of have to return to it knowing that it's not finished, and it's not kind of what you are envisioning, with the hope that, you know, one day it'll be close to that.
Yeah, it really takes that, it really is a kind of act of faith to just like work on it in these small increments, and know that at the end of a workday you may feel no closer at all to the goal, but that it's part of incrementally kicking the can down the road in a way. And I don't know, one other thing about novel writing that just felt really true to me by the end of the process was that you can't hide from yourself or from other people in a novel, because it's so much space and so much material. On a craft level, you can't hide from the things that you may not be as strong as you want to be in, because they'll come up unless you really have some kind of extreme formal premise of some kind. And then also, I think your own thought patterns and ideas, just an experiences kind of bubble up even in fiction, and that I don't know, it's really, I mean, putting a long work out there feels so vulnerable, just because even in fiction, like, so much of you is just there. I found that really scary.
I bet.
I love that. I love that a lot. I love that answer.
One thing I always love to do in any book I read is kind of read through the acknowledgments. And one thing that I noticed was that you said that you wrote the book in, I think, 6 states and 5 countries over the course of like however many years. I'm curious, kind of, yeah, what was what did that look like for you writing this novel? Were you doing a lot of residencies or?
Yeah, I move around a lot. Maybe it could be because I'm a Sagittarius and I just have some like wanderlust. But I think it also is just the cold hard economics of trying to exist as a writer. And I moved around to also try to go to different opportunities. So I started writing the novel in Arizona at my grad school, and then like many graduates of MFA, I was grasping at what to do next and how to support myself while I was writing. And I was lucky enough to get a Fulbright, so I went to Bulgaria, did some writing there, and other places in Europe as well. And then coming back to the US, I knew I could not afford to live in New York City and still have time to write. So I moved to Houston because it was more affordable, but still has just like incredible arts community. So I lived there for 3 years, and I miss it every day because it just is a really amazing place. And I think just moving around, and so there were some residencies in there. Moving around was really about like, how can I maximize the amount of time I can spend on working on this novel while also like having a place to live and earning some money. And it was really hard, and it's like moving makes it hard to write too, because you're like trying to settle into a new space. But I don't know, I'm someone who just draws a lot from place and from the different ecologies of a place and like people that I meet. So it's also stimulating. It also really feeds the writing practice and just everything that I'm doing. But it was really difficult too.
I kind of want to ask you this just because it almost is feeling like a reoccurring theme with some of the people that we've been talking to this last year, which is like the realities of kind of the practicalities of life, and also the dreams that you're working towards, wanting to, make writing work, but also like needing to make enough money to stay indoors and eat food, which are also nice things. And so like, what has that felt like for you? What has that looked like for you, balancing those two things?
Well, I think it has been moving around, for one thing, to just meet those other opportunities. It has meant being willing to just maybe live in some situations that were uncomfortable, and just know that making art, in this case, felt more important than having some nice stuff, or having an apartment that was not full of fleas.
Oh, now we gotta hear that story.
Wait. Hold up.
Not gonna let that slide, I guess. Well, okay, so while I was living in Houston, some raccoons moved into the attic of the larger building that I was in, and
roommates,
they were not so hygienic, and all the buildings were just totally flea infested, and it was not a highlight, but it was a chance to end up having to bathe my cat, which I don't know if you've ever bathed a cat. It's
no.
It's horrifying and kind of hilarious because they get so much, with their fur kind of wet, they get so small. So I mean, she hated it, we hated it too, but it was also kind of funny. And eventually the issue did subside. But I think, if I had more just spare income, or had a job that wasn't kind of random freelance editing or teaching, I probably would have been like, I can't live in this this apartment. I gotta live in a better place. I've got to just have more creature comforts. I think kind of making these choices all the time to prioritize art as much as I could just came with costs, and I'm grateful that it worked out, but I also really empathize with the struggle of finding time and also trying to stay alive, quite frankly, because the stress, financial stress, the health, the cost on your body can just be so hard. And I think that's why it's people always complain about resources for young writers, say, and how that it's ageist, etc. And there are cases to be made for it being ageist, but at the same time, I think it's so important that resources are out there for emerging writers, for young writers, just so that they can get their foot in the door and get those projects made, because otherwise it's just incredibly difficult.
Did you grow up kind of imagining yourself as like being somebody who was invested in writing? Like, I don't know if it was like a writer necessarily, but I think of myself, like I write a lot now, but I definitely didn't grow up. I grew up like hating English. It was probably like one of my least favorite subjects. And lo and behold, it's like 2 master's degrees later, somehow that kid ended up being a writer. I'm curious kind of what was your relationship to writing in your childhood and whatnot?
I'll tell you, but I really want to know what the switch was for you. Like,
yeah,
how do you go from hating writing to 2 master's degrees?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up I went to a public school and was like really falling behind in English, and I had to do like extra help classes and things like that. And this is probably like 2nd or 3rd grade. So I think at that age I was just kind of like, fuck this, like I don't like English. I don't like reading. I'm bad at it. So for probably up through high school, I was like, I'm going to be a science kid. Well, also not being very good at that, at least from my recollection. And honestly, I mean, it is kind of like the Hallmark story, but I had a English teacher in high school who, one day I must have been writing during that time period. I had asked her if she could like look at this novel I was working on. And she's like, yeah, you can come during my, 10-minute break. And basically she would meet with me like every 10-minute break for the rest of the time. Like, this is my junior year of high school through like the rest of high school. And basically just edit this completely horrible novel with me. And then from there, I was like, oh, maybe I could do this. So yeah, it was kind of, I think I probably just needed that positive reinforcement for something that I was already doing.
That's amazing. And yeah, a million shout outs to the good teachers of the world.
Shout out Mrs. Schaefer.
I don't know. I guess I really wasn't one of those people who grew up being like, I'm going to be a writer, do or die. And I think that was in part because both my parents were had tried to pursue the arts. My mom tried to pursue writing, and my dad tried to pursue painting, and they ended up kind of going into adjacent fields. My dad was a public art teacher, high school art teacher, and my mom was a librarian. And so I think I just had a complex about pursuing the arts and not like hitting a wall of some kind. And I just recognized that there wasn't a ton of money to be had in this field. So even though I was kind of doing creative things, I went to college being like, I'm going to be an economist because that's a surefire way to success. But it was really clear really early that was not my forte. And I think I did not, I wasn't like an English major or creative writing major, but I couldn't resist taking those classes, and also a lot of studio art classes. I majored in American Studies. And then after college, I did an environmental fellowship. I was backpacking around New Zealand after that. And I just realized that I really wouldn't be happy unless I was writing, that I wouldn't have like a sense of meaning and fulfillment if I wasn't making stuff. And from there I decided to go to grad school and not look back, basically. But I truly tried really hard to do other things and just couldn't find traction. It would have been great to be able to be a scientist, but I just like, it wasn't where my heart was at when I was honest with myself.
What was your Fulbright? What do you pursue for that year?
I was an English teacher.
Oh, okay.
So I was in a school, and I think one of the highlights of that experience was running a creative writing club with the students in this high school, and putting together a literary magazine with them. So that was really fun.
That's awesome. Ben, yeah.
One of the things that, just to kind of circle back to the, just because I think we're talking about it or talking around it in some ways, and I just wanted to ask you, like, in some ways I think this book is might be the answer, but how do you think about, grappling with climate change, and that kind of can hang over your head? Concerns about the future, concerns about the world, concerns about whether I'm doing enough, and like the day to day, and I think something that I've been feeling a lot lately, especially in the era of COVID, is like, wow, I'm going to work, and I sit down at my desk sometimes, and what am I doing? Like, what is the purpose of this? Does this have any value if, the world is in the midst of all of these different, calamities? And so I'm wondering if you can just talk about, for you, what that looks like.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a perfect answer for this at all, because it's like or anything, but and I think I too, as I've said, like, grapple with it every single day. But I think one of the ways I think about it is, and this is a kind of piece of advice that I got from an environmental educator, was recognizing that every person has a sphere of influence of some kind, and no matter your occupation. Obviously, you might have a bigger sphere of influence if you're like a senator or something in some ways, but we all have a community that we're interacting with in some way. We have certain choices that we are able to make within our maybe our work environment in some capacity. So on one hand, just kind of looking at what is my sphere of influence and how can I show up in a way that kind of pushes forth my values and the kind of environmental ideas that I want to have out there. How can I do that every single day? And then, but I think that has to be paired with just a recognition that climate change isn't ultimately like our responsibility as individuals so much as a structural problem that is like the real offenders are corporations, fossil fuel companies, and to sort of just like shoulder the whole weight of climate change as just people is a losing game. So I think it is kind of, I think when it comes to addressing climate change, kind of being just aware of the larger structural apparati that are in motion, and being ready to, I don't know, participate in a mass mobilization should it come could also be useful. And like kind of just mentally having a mind that is open to that possibility seems important as well, and not just shutting down the possibility for big change, because I do think that could happen, and if we have to at least believe that it could happen if it ever is going to.
Yeah.
And I mean, think about the fact that like the Green New Deal was a phrase that meant nothing a couple of years ago, but it has like gained traction as just a possibility, and is like so much more mainstream now. And I think that's been part of just people opening their minds and their imaginations to that possibility. And so I guess that's what I mean.
Yeah, I think speaking to that, I was listening to another conversation that you had with, I don't remember right now, but, you were talking about fiction writers or maybe just writers in general, and kind of engaging with climate change in their work. I didn't actually get to finish the quote, so I'd love for you to just hear a little bit about like you talking through like what are things that writers can be doing, or what are some ways that writers can engage with climate change on the page, or like how do you envision that?
Well, I think writers, artists can and should continue imagining better futures and like the logistical paths to those better futures. And, it's useful to use our imaginative energy to imagine, societal collapse. And that certainly has its purpose too, but we can also imagine the opposite. And that can be a way to give people the kind of mental handholds to figure it out in the real world. And then in a more kind of subtle way, bringing just the natural world into your writing in a way that kind of implicitly applies value to it seems important to me. Kind of whether your characters are, directly thinking about the environment around them and how they impact it and how it impacts them, you can still have that relationship happening on the page. And I think, a book that is kind of obsessed with, say, like brands and corporations and putting that language and that diction on the page is in a way, I think, it can be a way of like overvaluing those things. And I think a book that's like paying attention to botanical terms and meteorological terms and kind of, implicitly valuing them in that way can be useful too.
I love that. Is there something we haven't asked you about this book, or about your life that you want to say, that you want to, put out there? It's okay if you don't have anything burning. We have to ask because there's always a chance that maybe there's something we're not asking that you're like, listen, there's this one thing.
And I'm like, this is my moment. I can say anything I want. I'm just going to say that I hope that people don't give up on our future, basically. And that for all the challenges that are ahead in the best and worst case scenarios, I still think like we have to believe a better future is possible in order to make it at all a viable kind of reality. So that's my message.
I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there a portion of the book that you would be interested in maybe just reading?
Sure. How much are you looking for?
What was that one section, Ben? Was it like 213, was it?
It is. It is but a paragraph, but it's on 213. It's about oceans and memory. Oh, really it's real good.
Yeah. Why don't I read that right now?
I mean, no pressure. If there's another section, I don't want to sway your hand.
I think
I just also really love that section.
I think that's a good one. All right, here we go. The same marine biologist who told me about the ocean hole also described how the ocean keeps a record of all our actions. The water, he told me, absorbs the heat of human industry and holds it in a vast liquid memory. The intense storms we experience now are manifestations of decisions made decades before. And the storms of the future, ever more violent, ever more devastating, will be this present resurging as the past. Isn't that interesting, he said? The ocean never forgets.
That's good. Allegra, thank you so much for coming on and, talking with us about the book and life and giving us some writing tips. It was really, really great to read your novel and to talk with you.
Yeah, this was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, that was our conversation with Allegra Hyde about Eleutheria, about writing, about activist groups. Yeah, I really appreciated, especially how she talked a little bit about her own journey with like being a full-time writer and like making a writerly life, because it isn't glamorous, for most people. I think she did a good job of kind of articulating that and being real with us. So I really appreciated that.
I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate, like, I think I look at someone like Allegra, and I'm like, oh, you're incredibly accomplished. Like, here you have, you have a novel published. Like, you're out in the world as an author. And so I appreciate that kind of peek behind the veil there, where it's like, actually, it's kind of hard a lot of times. My roommates might be a raccoon. Like, I'm going through a lot. I think honesty about like what it takes to get into the industry, what it takes to live day to day in the industry, I think is just like such useful information. Phil, I think we talked about this, but like when I was getting my master's degree in English, probably one of my favorite classes, I had a professor who was like, you won't make it. It's not going to work out. You probably shouldn't be in this field. It is incredibly hard work. I think in some ways trying to get rid of that like survivor bias that I feel like a lot of people in the field have, where it's like, hey, it'll work out if you like, publish enough and work hard enough, you can get there. And I just still think about that. And so I think that, I am hungry often for kind of the candidness around like how much work it takes and how even with hard work, you might not make it.
Yeah. And I think this conversation, and one that's going to be coming down the pipeline at a different point in time. We've been talking to a lot of authors who I would say are closer in age to us and kind of, went through like the MFA, MA industrial complex or whatever in terms of like writing and like trying to make a writerly life. And yeah, I think we've talked a lot to them about like professionalization and like how oftentimes these institutions aren't real with you, or like they don't set you up in ways that like are conducive to actually getting out of the program and like making a life for yourself where you can make your art and you can still live. And I think that's just kind of been the theme for a lot of these conversations lately of working through that. And yeah, so I mean, I think this conversation was really elucidating in that way. And I gotta say, I definitely appreciate guests like Allegra who, you ask them. There's one point in the conversation where we asked her about novel writing or something like that, and she like flipped the conversation and like asked us about it. And I think as the interviewer, it always catches you a bit off guard because you don't really expect the interviewee to be like, not necessarily that they're not going to be interested in you, but you just don't expect them to like be asking you questions. And I love when that happens. So like that was a really cool little moment, I think.
Yeah. Also seemed like to be genuinely interested. And yeah, I don't know. Obviously, it always feels nice when you're like, oh, thank you. Thanks for your genuine interest. Yeah.
Well, cool. That was our conversation with Allegra Hyde. You can find her novel Eleutheria like probably anywhere, any bookstore. Definitely worth a read if you're looking for a new climate fiction novel with a interesting protagonist. And you can learn more about her and her other work at allegrahyde.com, as well as on Twitter at Allegra_Hyde. Ben, where can they learn more about you?
They can learn more if they want to, and I wouldn't recommend it at sad_radio_lad. Our email, if you wanted to, toss some questions our way, if you want to say you liked an episode, if you want to pitch us future episodes, is theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. You can also check out our website, which Phil has been aggressively hard at work at originstory.show. Our Twitter's origin story with an underscore right after. And our Instagram, Phil, we got an Instagram now.
Follow that Instagram.
.show. Follow, like, I don't know. What else do you do with an Instagram?
I don't know. You won't see us doing TikTok dances or whatever, real dances on there anytime soon. But hell, if enough people follow, you'll see me up there. So
if we get 1,000 follows, I'll post a photo of my butthole.
Oh, that might be an anti-follower call to action.
Oh.
But
all right, well, never mind. I take it back.
Different audience, Ben.
Okay, wrong crowd.
But you can find out more about me on Twitter at 3D Cisco, or check out my column at unwinnable.com called Eyeing Elsewhere. Always some new stuff popping up on there. Yeah, as always, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Give us a follow. Tell your mom, tell your brother, tell your partner to check out the show.
We should probably cut that part about the butthole, right?
I mean, I think we got to keep that in there. We got to really.
I'm on the fence.
That's going to be preserved for the archive. Yeah, and so that's our episode. Tune in again for the next episode where Ben probably talks about his butthole again. And we'll have
Thank God my parents don't know how to work a podcast, because if they did, I would be in some serious trouble.
I'll personally text your dad. Check it out. Check out the episode.